La 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 da 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 dee da dum. La 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 da da dum. Rio de Sant Anzolo. On Tuesday, the 19th of August, 2024, I set out with my wife for an Italian adventure. Our adventure in Italy began in Venice, or Venezia, where we stayed at the Palazzo Peruta Hotel. The building that houses the Palazzo Peruta is, like nearly every building on the island of Venezia, ancient. The Palazzo Peruta on the island of San Marco is accessed via a pedestrian bridge that crosses the Rio de Sant Anzolo. In Venice, the phrase pedestrian bridge is redundant. All bridges in Venice are strictly for pedestrians or wheeled carts. Cars, motorbikes, and bicycles are prohibited from Venice's flagstone Calli, Campos, and Piazza, which is understandable, considering the narrowest Calli have widths decidedly narrower than 2 meters. Plus, the ubiquitous bridges over the canals have steps, not arched roadways. Though the building that houses the Palazzo Peruta is a former palace from the 1600s, the lovely hotel has been renovated as recently as 2008. It is extremely quaint, as are the modern upgrades the Venetians managed to superimpose on their up to 1,300-year-old architectural superstructure. I am not a great world traveler. My August adventure with my wife brings me to 6 European countries that I have visited since the mid-1990s, along with a slightly greater number of Caribbean islands nations since 1986. I found our hotel staff reminiscent of my 2 trips to Switzerland, helpful, courteous, and respectful, but not brimming with bon ami. Venezia has an extremely rich history, but it is the tiny substructure of the Palazzo Peruta's breakfast room about which I am writing. The room itself is on the 2nd floor and is accessed via a sweeping outdoor stairway. Exclusively accessed via the sweeping stairway during our visit, as the elevator was not in service. We wouldn't have taken the elevator even if it had been working, but certain things, such as some public buildings in Europe having main exit doors that open inward rather than outward, a tremendous fire safety hazard, and hotel rooms that can only be locked via a key and a deadbolt lock, were 2 obvious safety concerns that reminded me that not everything in the USA is backwards compared to Europe. And yes, I understand that having doors that open inward can be a necessity when some of Venice's streets are barely wider than a door. Regardless, the breakfast room was exquisite. There were fewer than a dozen tables that could seat as many as 3 dozen diners. Each table was set with a fine tablecloth, a centerpiece, and silverware, and the room's decor was picturesque with a very tall ceiling, accented by paintings and other artwork on the walls. Upon arriving for breakfast, we were greeted by the maître d'hôtel, who was both superb as well as pleasant caricature from a 1960s romantic comedy such as the French film Le Grand Restaurant. Our maitre d' was a pleasant host, not a snipping Monsieur Teptani, and after asking our room number, seated us at a table for 2. As is my wont, I sat with my back to the wall so I could watch the room. Thin, dark hair, dressed in a black tuxedo, our effervescent Monsieur Teptami was continuously on the move, smiling, chatting, and with help from his assistant, serving. Monsieur Teptami's performance and service was outstanding. Back in 1980, my wife and I met while working in a restaurant together, and Monsieur Septimi was such a pleasure to watch, I'd intended to tell him so prior to departing from our first of 3 mornings that we would spend there. As fate would have it, when we left that morning, he was elsewhere, but I did make a point of telling the staff at the front desk how delicious breakfast had been and how the maitre d' had enhanced our experience enormously. If only I had known Wednesday morning how different things would be on Thursday and Friday. As we sat down for breakfast on Thursday, superficially, everything was the same as it had been on Wednesday. All that is except the assistants and the ambiance. Overnight, our jovial maitre d' had transformed from a delight to someone who stood in stark contrast. His displeasure was obvious in his body language and the tone of voice he used with his new-to-us assistant, and I at first assumed the kitchen must be down un quoi and that Monsieur Septime was having to perform extra services on Thursday as compared to Wednesday. But as breakfast progressed, I came to understand that it was the new assistant that was the cause of his angst. Wednesday's helper had played a pitch-perfect second fiddle to Monsieur Septimie's orchestrations, but today's assistant was seemingly still tuning her instrument well after the concerto had begun. I felt sorry for both Monsieur Septimie and the new assistant, and I hoped that Friday things would be better. They were not. My wife and I were uncertain about tipping in Europe, as it varies greatly from the United States, but we had decided we would tip Monsieur Septimie following our third and final breakfast Friday morning. Following our meal, I slipped him a few euros as we were leaving and whispered, "She'll get better." 3 words that made Monsieur Septimie's eyes open wide. "It is just that I've been doing this for 27 years, he said. "Oh, I know. I've been watching." "She'll get better," I repeated with a nod as my wife and I exited. Not knowing Monsieur Septimie, I don't know how he runs his dining room. I don't know if his is a top-down style of management with him at the top, or if his style is more egalitarian when his co-workers are up to snuff. But I am certain he wanted the guests' breakfasts to be delicious, well presented, and memorable in a good way. Sadly, I'm afraid his desire for perfection was creating a barricade for his new and very green assistant, and I hope he is able to see this and can be both mentor and taskmaster so she too, with time and training, can bloom and grow to his grand level of expertise and panache. Postscript. I wrote my essay on Wednesday, the 28th of August, and that night I had a bit of a nightmare. In my nightmare, I was working in a bicycle shop, something I began doing in 1985 and still do part-time, but it was not the shop where I currently work, nor any of the 11 locations with 8 separate store owners in 6 U.S. states that I have worked. It was in a small town. The shop was terribly disorganized, and I was given the simple task of fixing a flat tire on a child's bicycle while the mother and child waited. Bicycle stores frequently allow a panoramic view of the workshop area, though the store I have worked in for nearly 7 years does not. A panoramic view is one thing, but in my nightmare store, the mother and child stood directly in front of me within touching range. Having replaced over 50,000 bicycle tubes since 1985, the task should have been simple, but the tubes at this store had to be assembled. Huh? The rubber tube was not attached to the valve, and the valve's inner workings had to be installed. The 2 odd circumstances that made a 5-minute job go on inexorably, while mother and child became more and more impatient. Additionally, to my left, a coworker sat at another workbench with bike parts piled on top that he was shining with semi-chrome polish. An inexplicable task whose process was messy and extraordinarily odd, to say the least. In my nightmare, I was agitated and distressed because I was completely capable of doing the job I was tasked with, but the conditions with which I was presented did not allow me to do so. My nightmare presented me with the very problem Monsieur Septimie faced with his new assistant.